So that's how we handle basic queries. Let's look at making this a little bit more advanced by doing something called compound queries. Right. So with the basic queries, what we were doing is we were writing up a comparison of one variable to one value. With compound queries, what we can do is we can start to connect multiple queries together. Right. So we can start to compare multiple variables or maybe the same variable to multiple values. Right. So the idea is that we can start to piece together more complicated selection criteria. Right. So for example, maybe we were interested in thinking about the cities again, right? Maybe we want to get the cities that are part of Florida, but also have a population of greater than 1 million, right? We can put those two things together in a compound query. So the way that compound queries work is you always have at least two queries, right? So we'll say this with query 1, query 2, query 3. So in this case, right, we have 3 queries, but you always have to have a minimum of 2 for a compound query. And then in between each query, we have a connector. Actually, let's make that a different color. Right, in between each query, you have a connector. Right, that connects the queries together. Now there are multiple connectors, but we're only going to focus on 2 because they are far and above. Well, actually, we'll focus on 3 because they are far and above the most commonly used, and the first 2 are almost exclusively. So the 3 connectors we have are, and they're English words, right? We have and, we have or, and we have not. Right? So the word and means that you have to meet all of the criteria. Oops. Connected with and. I'm going to move these over a little bit, give us a little bit of room here. Right? Or must meet any criteria connected with or. And then not isn't really used that often, but basically you must not meet this requirement. We're actually going to largely ignore not because it's not very usually used. Generally, what would happen with not is you would just use you would structure the query differently. So we're going to focus mostly on and or. And the way that I like to think of this, because sometimes it can get a little bit confusing when you're trying to differentiate between the two, I like to think of it like you're at a restaurant ordering food. right? And so the feature would be whatever dish the waiter brings out to you. The queries would be how you structure your order, right? And so, for example, dealing with the and, where you must meet all the criteria that are connected with and. So this would be, for example, if you ordered a hamburger at the restaurant and you told the waiter that I want a hamburger with ketchup and mustard, right? That would mean that the hamburger has to have ketchup on it and it also has to have mustard on it. If it doesn't have both, you won't eat it, right? So and means that it has to meet all of the criteria. So again, think about the hamburger, right? It has to have the ketchup and it has to have the mustard for you to be able to eat it, right? For the or, right, it just has to meet any one of the criteria, right? So for example, if you're ordering food in this case, right, you're looking at the menu and you don't really know exactly what you want. So you're like, I'll have a hot dog or a hamburger, right? Or maybe I'll have a Coke or a Pepsi. And then whichever one the waiter brings out, you'll be fine with, as long as it's a Coke or a Pepsi, right? So that's how or works, right? As long as it meets one of them, you keep it. So I know this can be a little bit confusing. So let's go ahead and go through several examples of this idea of compound queries. So let's imagine that we have census tract data with a population in 2020 and the number of occupancies or households that are renting. And the idea is that we want to find all of the census tracts that have a population of at least 1,000 and over 50% rental housing. Right. And so if we think about this compared to what we've done in the past, right, we're going to build our first query here of pop 2020. Right. At least means we want to use a greater than or equal to 1,000, right? We've done this exact query before. We have another query, right? Great, over 50% rental housing. So that's going to be OCC rent, right? Greater than 50. So I've built two separate queries here, one based on the 2020 population to cover this first piece, and then one based on the occurrence of rental based on this second piece. Now the idea here is that it needs to meet both of these requirements to be selected, right? Because we want to have, it has to have at least 1,000 people and have over 50% housing. Now the nice thing is whenever you see and in sentences like this, typically speaking, that translates to an and in the query, right? We need to have it have this and have that. Okay, so in this case, in order for it to be selected, it has to meet both, right? Just make this abundantly clear, right? Because of the and, right, it must meet both requirements. So let's look at another example. Right, in this case, right, we have some roadways and we're trying to figure out whether or not they need to be maintained or paved. And so the idea is we have two different conditions. We have the surf type, so that's what type of surface the road has, and then we have the condition, which is the quality of the road itself. And the idea is that we want to find roads that need to have paving or repaving in the next 5 years. So one situation where that could occur would be if the condition is poor, meaning the road is not maintained. Another would be if the type of road is dirt, because we would want to convert that to paving. So we want to find all of the roads that meet those two conditions. So in this case, right, again, we're going to break this up into two separate queries, right? The condition is poor. This condition is poor, right? This is one condition. So we can write a query for that, right? Condition equals poor, right? That's a single query based on this piece here, right? We have another query that we can write, surface type of dirt, right? Surf type equals dirt. Oop, let's not capitalize all that, that's unnecessary, right? And again, all I've done is I've taken the two different criteria, right? Surface type of dirt and condition of pour, and I've turned those into individual queries. Now in this case, right, we can grab them in either way, right? If it's a poor condition road, we want it. If it's a dirt road, we want it. So it only has to satisfy one of these conditions for us to want to return it. So in that case, right, if it can meet either or both or any, right, we're going to use or here. Right, again, just to be clear, right, because of this or, right, can meet right, the feature can meet either condition. Right. So let's go through some review questions. So the first question is going to be, we're dealing with the Housing and Urban Development Agency, so HUD, and basically we're trying to figure out which areas we're going to prioritize funding to. So the idea is that we're looking for those census tracts that have both a high cost of housing and a low minimum wage or median wage. And we're given the two variables that we want, med HP for the housing price and med wage for the wage. So go ahead and read through the question and try to answer it on your own. Okay, let's go ahead and work through the problem together. So just like before, we're going to break this down into its different queries. So the first query that we want to do is we want to find the median house price of at least $40,000. Right, this is the first kind of query that we have here. And turning that into a query, we have median house price, which is med HP, of at least, and we know whenever we see at least, that means greater than or equal to 40,000 or 400,000, right? We also have this second piece here of median wage of at most 30,000. And we know that the attribute here is med wage. So we know that we can make a second query of med wage. And when we see at most, we know that that is a less than or equal to 30,000, right? And because we have this and here, we know that we need to satisfy both of these criteria. So we would use the connector and. So we need to find the census tracts that have a median housing price of 400,000, greater than or equal to 400,000, and a median wage of less than 30. So this would be the compound query here. All right, let's go through another review question. So this time we're working for the Coast Guard, and we want to analyze data related to shark attacks. In this case, we want beaches that have greater than 300 visitors on days in either June or July with at least 15 shark observations. The attributes for daily visitors is day viz, the attribute for sharks is shark count, and the attribute for month is month. And I'm going to warn you, there's actually going to be 4 queries built into this. So go ahead, give it a shot, and then we'll come back together to try to figure out the answer. Okay, so let's go ahead and work through our answer here. So like I said before, there's actually 4 queries in here. We need to look at 300 visitors relative to Davis. Actually, let's color code that. All right. We know we need to do a 300 visitors tied to Davis. We know we need to do a 15 shark observations relative to shark count. But then we also need to do 2 comparisons, right, of June to month, but also July to month, right? And this one here is a little bit tricky because we can only test, right, if we remember back to our queries, right, each query only has 1 value. So June to month and July to month are going to be 2 separate queries. So let's go ahead and write that down. Well, the first thing that we want to do, right, is we want to get whether or not the month is in June or July. So that's going to be month, right, is equal to June, and month is equal to July. Right, and because it can be either June or July, right, we connect these with an or. Right, we know that we want to have greater than 300 visitors, so that's going to be 300. Ooh, sorry, backwards. That's going to be Davis, right, is greater than 300. And then we also know that we want to have at least 15 shark observations relative to shark count. Whenever we see at least, we know that that means greater than or equal to 15. Now, we know that what we're looking for are days that meet the month criteria and have this many visitors and have this many sharks, right? Because it has to meet either May or June, but then it has to have 300 visitors and sharks. So it's either one of these, but then all of those. This one's a little bit more complicated. Hopefully you got it right. Hopefully the explanation makes sense.